Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Media Talks at Google. The Google News team, Richard and I, are so excited to bring in another incredibly innovative entrepreneur in the digital space. Steven Levy is the editor-in-chief of Medium. And with that, let's welcome Steven Levy.
And thanks, Stacy. I actually need to give a shout out to Stacy because she's done a great job putting this series together. And we'll be doing quite a bit more as we go forward because we have such, I think, great opportunities to bring interesting people to come talk to us at Google. So Stacy does all the hard work and I just get to sit up here and talk to folks. So thank you for that. So, Steven Levy has been writing about Silicon Valley like before there was a Silicon Valley, long time. Without question, one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent and prolific tech writers of our generation. He's written 7 books about everything from cryptology to Apple, a couple of books about Apple. And of course, one significant one about Google, which with that 2011 book, In the Plex, I think is generally considered to be the definitive book about Google. And Larry and Sergey gave you unprecedented access, and the result was a really superb work on your part, and we thank you for that. Of course, he's written extensively about Apple over the years. Besides those books, his obituary on Steve when he died was the most read story ever on Wired.com, not surprisingly. Now Steven is at Medium as editor-in-chief of Medium and also created their tech-focused back channel. And we'll be talking about some of that today as well. So as usual, I'm going to start off with maybe a half a dozen or so questions. And then we're going to open it up to the Dory and the folks in this room, so get your thoughts together. I'm going to say, given that you have spent as much time as you have covering the sector, covering major companies, and getting deep inside Google. In looking at the state of the industry and the ecosystem today, what do you think that Google could do better compared to other tech companies?
Okay. Well, first of all, let me thanks for that great introduction. I actually should say I'm the editor-in-chief of Back Channel, not of all of Medium. I don't think Medium has an editor-in-chief, but thanks for the kind words, and it's great to be here. I'm going to say something that I think Google's been doing a better job of over the years, but still can do better at, and that's transparency. I think that a lot of the issues that Google finds itself mired in, a lot of the suspicions that people have about Google could be mitigated with even more openness. I found Google, when I looked into it, as sort of like a lobster. It was sort of like crusty on the outside. It was hard for an outsider generally to know what was going on. But on the inside, it was all soft and mushy. Everyone in Google knows what's going on at Google. Google did a great job of letting the people who work there know what was happening there. All your internal communications. You could look up anyone and see what they were working on, which I thought was fantastic. And giving me access was, sort of something that was a step that Google took, which I think, helped Google. And I think that by and large, you do see, people from Google interviewed, and but I think you can go farther than that. And I think that the more you share the way you think with us, the better off you're going to be.
And I think that's a valid point. I've certainly gotten that criticism many times from folks who are saying it's just too much of a black box, from publishers who we work with and so on. Now, having said that, I want to just poke a little bit further because, I said in comparison, and I'm not looking for laudits here, but we look at Apple, of course, which is, profoundly and notoriously secret. Facebook, not so sure. Is anyone, who would you say is doing it right, for that matter?
Well, I think Facebook has been more open there. So, I have, like a period, I haven't talked to them like recently, but I had like a streak where, I was like not a stranger to Mark Zuckerberg's office, and I wasn't the only journalist like there. In a sense, they have a lot of radioactive things they present to us, and so they understand that they talk us to death really, and diffuse it there. You're right. Apple is super secretive. I think they're starting to come out of that just a little there. You're seeing. It used to be. It's sort of like the opposite of Google. Google, for a long period, Larry, did his interviews were and still are very rare. It's not a secret. It's not his favorite thing to do. Whereas Apple, for many years, the only person you wind up talking to would be the CEO, right? So I had zillions of conversations with Steve Jobs, but it was harder to get conversations with the people working for him. He said that, I don't want people to hire him away from me there. And then there were some that you would see, like the marketing people. To get in with engineers was really tough. And I think Google actually does a pretty good job of that. I spent a lot of time with engineers, and you make them present there. Some of the other ones, like I've spent a lot of time with Twitter. They're pretty open there. Microsoft, again, you can spend a lot of time with Microsoft, and I've had zillions of dives, going through those corridors, of their buildings there, talking to people there. It's you give up something when you let a journalist in. It's very competitive industry, obviously, and there's secrets to have, but generally, I think by letting people know what you're doing, they feel better about you.
I'm going to switch subjects a bit. Folks can ask more questions about your perceptions of Google if they'd like. But you're a technology journalist who's covered the tsunami of change over the last 15, 20 years, including obviously with the practice and business of journalism itself. So, from your perspective, are you pessimistic, optimistic? What gets you excited? What gets you depressed in these transitions?
I'm generally optimistic, though I have my moments of darkness. I think that what journalists and serious journalists have to offer is so valuable that there will always be a call for them. That there's always going to be like a need for people to read that stuff and get briefed on that. I think that consistently, when a journalist produces a work of value, dives into it, spends days, weeks, months working on something, carefully, you could see it's carefully vetted and presented. There's always a response. There's always appreciation from this. I see it at Back Channel, which is the thing we just created. It went live last October there. The first really lengthy story, because we didn't have a built-in audience. The first really lengthy story we did. It's a story by this woman named Susan Crawford, who's an expert on internet access, and she's a law professor at Harvard, but also has written a couple of books. She did this really detailed thing, based on like data analysis. Some of them were the group that actually Google participated with, about how the Cogent network was being throttled in some indirect way by Comcast because of their war with Netflix, and it was really complicated, and it was like about a 6,000-word story or something like that with charts and things like that. And I thought, well, man, who's going to read this, right? And it became at that time our most popular story, our first story really to the rise up well into six figures there. So that shows me there's a huge appetite for this. On the other hand, I can't ignore the depopulated newsrooms, and that some of the newsrooms that have sprung up are full of people who are rewriting other people's stories and posting listicles. I think it was not a happy moment for me when I saw in the New York Times run a story a couple weeks ago, 5 things you didn't know about Hillary Clinton. I thought, where did that come from, right? I mean, what was the discussion in the newsroom about that? So I worry sometimes.
Well, let's go a little bit further on that. I think what's excited us about the internet, particularly those of journalistic bent, is just how open the environment is for free expression. Far more open than any environment we've had in the history of civilization, for that matter. But it's also under threat, and in some ways obvious, governments or issues like net neutrality, but others in less and more nuanced ways. We talk about, for instance, billions of users coming online around the world, but they're, because of data plans or whatever, they're using 2 or 3 apps, and the web isn't among them.
Right.
On mobile, we're frankly seeing a decline of the mobile web in terms of time spent. We're seeing an increase in walled gardens from Facebook to Snapchat, so on, all which are sort of chewing away theoretically at this open environment. Does that concern you? Do you have, a perspective to share?
Oh, I think it is something. To my more parochial concern is that just the mobile format is one that doesn't necessarily welcome the kind of complex, long form, articles, that I think are important to understanding our world, and I'm still waiting to see what we come up with to make up for that. That's concerning. But in terms of the narrowing, it is a concern, because if just a few apps are going to be our filters that all journalists for all publications have to take them through, that's a problem. I've been watching with fascination. I've spent a lot of time with the Facebook newsfeed group, and done several articles about them, because they're, I think, they're genuinely attempting to balance what their users see, and they find themselves in a position where, for a lot of their users, they're curating, algorithmically, I guess, the world of news that comes through the news feed there. And they don't want the world of news to be trivial, but they sort of paint themselves into a corner by saying, well, what people click on is what people like, right? And I invented this concept called the dozen donuts concept that I've run by them, which is, if you go to work someplace, and the first day they say, would you like a dozen donuts delivered to the office? You're probably going to say no, because I'm going to put on a lot of weight if someone brings a dozen donuts every day. But if they just bring a dozen donuts, you're going to see the donut's going to be there and you're going to eat it there, right?
Particularly if you chop them up into bite-sized pieces.
That's right. Yes.
Posts in the feed.
So the donut holes or whatever, if they not only ask you, they take them there. They'll see you taking it. They'll say, "Wow, this guy really likes donuts. Let's bring more donuts there, right?" And then that's the way the news feed works, and and they have to get around that. And they're doing things now like trying to say, well, maybe we should vet some of these stories to find out they're not hoaxes, and have them percolate through. And then a couple months ago they said, well, gee, maybe there's just too much news. People aren't seeing news from their friends and more, and then that changes there. When, what is it, 20, 25, 30% what the time people spend on mobile is Facebook? Is that your Facebook feed there? That's an issue there, and and I think it's going to be tough, because, face it, the publications, an individual app, an app for back channel, as opposed to like Medium, which of course has its app. That would be tough to compete with space. And then you have your back channel app, your New Yorker app, your New York Times app, your Newsweek, your everything. It's going to be confusing there. So as we move to this, we have to figure out where you can get your news from a range of different places. The same kind of range you had pre-mobile.
Right. I'm sure I know people in this room who are going to take advantage of that dozen donuts metaphor. So just make sure to call it Stephen Levy's dozen donuts metaphor.
I have given thought to the idea of, when you come up with a meme and things like that. And I think I've reached the Zen state where I've passed having it, attributed to me. I was the first person to say the mother of all demos for the Doug Engelbart demo there, and Wikipedia recognized it. That's all I need, right? Just like so you could look it up, but you don't need. I don't need to be cited each time.
No, my father-in-law wrote the meme. I am Spartacus, and
Oh,
so
really?
it's been
Whoa.
always it's amusing. Like the Je suis Hebdo, and I say, wait, credit where credit is due. Ain't gonna happen. Let's talk about Medium. What was your impetus in joining?
So, I'd been thinking at that point last year. It's a little over a year ago that I had this idea. I haven't even actually been at Medium for a year yet. That I've been working at big news organizations for 18 years. I was a freelancer. I joined Newsweek. I spent 12 years at Newsweek when it was really Newsweek. And then took a buyout, like a lot of people did, and went to Wired, which sort of had been an informal home for me since the thing started, but it belonged to a big media organization, Condé Nast. So that's 18 years during this time of amazing change that I was working for the old guys, right? And I thought, wow, I'd like to do something new, and in a way a reaction to what was happening on the internet there, because I saw it, even at Wired. Wired.com ran like 50 stories a day. Right, and a lot of them were just because they needed stories there. The business model was to get as many page views as possible and sell ads against them. And I had an idea that, gee, what if we did something that we did a lot fewer stories, maybe even just one a day even, and said that was it. And the idea was that our competition wouldn't be these publications in toto, but the best thing that those publications does. So, in a given day on Back Channel, is my story as good as the best story in the New York Times business section or on The Verge or any of these other places there? Would that be a place? And I had been looking, Medium had been coming up in my feed more and more. I'd seen a lot of good stuff on there. And they had professional journalists, they were paying people to do stuff, but it wasn't really so much centered around publications there. So I ran into Ev Williams, who's the CEO of Medium, and you all know me. He was here when Google bought his company Blogger, which he founded, and then of course he co-founded Twitter. And so Medium is his thing, and I approached him at TED over a year ago, and said we should talk. And we wound up talking, and it wound up that I found a home. And also, I was just hungry to join one of these internet companies and experience what that was like. I'd visited countless companies there, and one of the fun things now is that there was always a time when I'd visit the company, and then I'd leave, and the interesting things would happen. They go to the meeting and do stuff that they wouldn't talk about to journalists. And so now I'm in the room there for the interesting stuff.
And I think as you're learning, it's evolutionary, it's experimental, explorational. I mean, there's no visible business model underneath Back Channel.
So today, actually, I have to say, is a special day for me. It's the first day that Back Channel's turned a buck.
Really?
Yes, we published this a story today. It was sponsored by a company that that used to be Elance, and they did a series on the future of work. We've labeled it clearly as done in partnership with them. You look it up. It's written by Kevin Maney, who's a distinguished tech journalist there. And we've included it in Back Channel today. And tomorrow we have another one that's in partnership with Samsung, which is sort of an interview with Harper Reid, telling what his pivotal moment was on becoming who he was there. So Ev is very clear that saying we can take our time. He believes building an audience first, monetization later. But we thought it was time to introduce a little revenue into this world.
And also, as I think you're experiencing, being in a startup means things change.
Absolutely.
And I know recently there have been stories of changes in strategy at Medium, cutbacks in certain areas. Evan made a point in a post about Medium not being a publishing platform, but a network. And so is the thinking to become more of a social platform? What's going on?
Right. So the way I've explained it was, and everyone said, described it like he woke up one day and said, oh, we have to go from this to that. And he, pulled up the data, which is something he wrote early on, saying, that the things he said in that post were things that were always part of the idea that it was going to be, a network, so what he wanted to do, I would say it's a course correction to, double down on the network part of it there. So the idea was never to be a big media company, but to use these publications or use the journalistic talent that he hired in the service of building that network there. So I think and again, that kind of like changes and and experimentation is one reason why I wanted to come to a company like that. So I think we're still doing back channel. One thing that you're going to see, and if you look carefully, you already saw it, is that we're going to start thinking, well, what ways can we use journalism to build our network growth? So for instance, last week, we did a story by David Weinberger, who's the guy who co-invented the Clue Train Manifesto. He's written some fantastic books on the internet. And he did a really interesting thing. He compared the questions that a CNN reporter interviewed Bernie Sanders with after Senator Sanders declared himself a candidate for president. And then he compared those to the Reddit AMA questions that were upvoted. And he got all the questions to CNN and all the questions from Reddit. And then he concluded the crowd does a better job of interviewing a presidential candidate than a professional journalist. And I changed that to, I ran it and changed that to please discuss. And I called up some people I know. Jonathan Alter, who was a former colleague at Newsweek. Dan Pfeiffer, who actually had written for Back Channel, who used to be, until recently, President Obama's chief of communications. Jay Rosen, who's one of the best critics from academia of the press. Dan Gilmore, Vivian Schiller, who until recently was Twitter's contact. She had been at NPR, the New York Times, and they responded to it. And then Craig Newmark spontaneously responded with his comment there. So we brought this in and made it more of a conversation. As a matter of fact, Jay's comment wound up, and the way responses work on Medium is really nice. If you keep writing, it really is almost like you're posting something original, because it doesn't stop you, not at 400, certainly not at 140 characters, but like nowhere. And he really made a whole post of it, and we brought it into the Back Channel collection there.
Well, since Weinberg concluded that the crowd asks better questions, I think I'll take my cue on
okay.
that one. Interestingly, since Stephen has probably interviewed some of you, and if not, many of your colleagues, it's our turn now to poke back at him. So in the room, if you've got a question, we do have a microphone that we would ask you to use because we are recording this, of course. I'm going to start with something from the Dory, and that's a very simple one. What's your next book? What are you working on?
So actually, when I did this, I had a book in mind that I put aside. It was going to be sort of this massive book about startups. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a book that Richard Ben Kramer, fantastic journalist who tragically died a couple of years ago, wrote, called What It Takes. And he did, I think it was the 1996 presidential election, every candidate, and it was like an 800-page book. This is going to be on like what it takes of startups. And I had cast the whole thing there, and I realized I could not do a thing of that proportion while I was doing this. To be honest, I've never worked harder than doing this thing for a startup. That's what you do, but I've never had more fun either. So, you not on that. Down the road, actually, I think someone else actually might be doing a book very much like that now. So maybe my window's passed for that. But there is another idea I have, which I probably don't want to share now. But it's probably a shorter book that is going to run more like a narrative there.
Okay. Questions from the room?
As an author and an observer of related industries, what do you think about DRM and books?
Interesting. I once had a conversation with Richard Stallman, who who I'd met when I did my first book, Hackers. This is a more recent conversation where he just went for 20 minutes why I should never let Amazon do one of my books there. I think philosophically, DRM, I see problems with it. About a year and a half, my mother died. She was an avid reader. She had 750 books on her Kindle there, right? And I have her Kindle, but Amazon won't let you move it over to yours. I have to keep her account alive to keep her books alive. That strikes me as wrong. On the other hand, I will say it's super easy to copy a book there. But generally, by and large, I do generally think the convenience is the way to fight piracy, as opposed to DRM. And I actually do agree with Jeff Bezos that, and there's been lawsuits, things like that selling lots of books at a lower price is probably the answer there. It seems a more attractive answer to me than DRM.
I'm going to go back to your, since again, you like me, come from of a different generation. I mean, computers when I was in college were punch cards. I believe you studied literature in college. So, what triggered your interest in technology and technology writing?
So, when I went to college, you're right. They were punch cards. We had our courses, we had to hand in these punch cards there, and the computer center was someplace we'd never visit, right? It was rolled off. And I went to grad school in literature and realized that I wasn't cut out for me, the work of a scholar. The teachers made that clear to me. And so one took pity on me and gave me an internship at the local newspaper in central Pennsylvania. At that point, they were switching from hot type to cold type, right? The people who worked, in the linotype type thing. There were some pretty unhappy people who used to be master craftspeople who were now, just pasting down things on boards, and and that was like the new wave. They were pretty unhappy, and I saw that. But I loved the writing part of it, and became a journalist and writing about all kinds of stuff. I was a rock critic. I interviewed Bob Marley. I covered sports and kind of other stuff. But in 1981, I got an assignment to write about computer hackers. I did a story for Rolling Stone about it, and it blew my mind. When I did my research, the only thing I could find presented hackers. This is before there were any association with bad behavior. They were more presented like booger-stained curiosities, total losers who couldn't relate to people. But when I came out, actually to California here, I went to Stanford, talked to other people in the burgeoning personal computer industry. The people blew my mind. They were like explorers, they were adventurers, and they were so excited about this, and they were onto something. This was the future there. Mm-hmm. And I said, this is what I have to write about. And pretty much from that point on, the bulk of my writing was about technology.
I'm really curious about you and what personal attributes you would attribute to having done the things that you did, like find Einstein's brain when no one else did that, and how you knew the right people to interview for hackers, and how you got that so right. It's fascinating.
Right. Actually, that's a great question. I think there is something in the personality of a journalist that is, it's a combination of curiosity and desperation, which leads us to go on when, even if our personalities in cocktail parties might not be aggressive, when we're on a story, you just have to be aggressive there. You mentioned the story about I found Einstein's brain when I was working for a magazine in New Jersey. My editor told me, go find Einstein's brain. And I actually figured out who had it and called up the guy on the phone. He hadn't talked to any reporter for 23 years, and he didn't want to talk to me. But to me, it was like every story I wrote back then, I figured if I didn't get this story, that's the end of my career. So I pushed and pushed until he agreed to see me there. So even though I might not be that way, personally, one-on-one, when I'm on a story, I still have some of that. And when I was at Newsweek, I remember it would just baffle me sometimes. We would get these interns from amazing schools And you'd say, can you call up these people and see what they have to say about X or Y? And then the next day you talk to them and they say, well, did you make the call? And said, yeah, the line was busy, or something like that. And I'd say, what? I mean, what field are you kind of getting in? Yeah. So you have to be, I guess, in some degrees, a little bit of a jerk to be a journalist.
Well, I'm gonna. You say you push and you push. I want to push you on that with regard to technique. Some of my very closest friends are journalists. It happens to me time and again, where I find that they get me to talk about stuff that I had no intention of talking about.
Well, you have to be pushy.
I don't mean business. I mean personal stuff.
You could push subtly, the Columbo kind of approach.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So come on, share a technique or two.
So one thing is, and this isn't in a pushy way, and it's actually, it seems obvious when I say it, but actually, if you look at other journalists, I watch other people do things, they don't do this enough, is to ask a direct question. A lot of times, particularly when it's a sensitive subject, people beat around the bush, like, oh, other people have said, or like I've heard talk that, and just ask the damn question, right? And don't be necessarily mean about it, but if you ask a direct question, especially when people aren't even expecting it, they're almost bracing for you to sort of beat around the bush because they know what you want to ask about. Ask the question, especially if it's a question that your readers want to know, right? Confront the elephant in the room right away. The other side is, that it is true that just shutting up sometimes will let the other person fill the gap there. And I remember early in my career, I'd listen to tapes when I transcribed there, and I would sort of talk to myself as I was listening to the tape, and I would say to myself, "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!" And you're cutting the person off, So after listening to enough of those tapes, I learned, if someone is saying something, don't stop them.
Well, I learned this in an entirely different realm of negotiation, where everyone's saying, well, same thing is let the pregnant pause last forever if it needs to. People will fill the vacuum, right? Don't rush in and change your
One guy who that technique doesn't really work on is Bill Gates. Bill Gates, he uses it against you. I went to his office once. I did the first story about the browser wars, right? Which is another phrase that the Microsoft's PR people said, you're the first one to talk about the browser wars. And I had just come from Netscape, and we went up to Bill Gates' office, and my editor from Newsweek was with me at the time. He wanted to see what it was like to interview Bill Gates, and I started, I said, Bill, I just came from Netscape, and they're saying you're doing this, and I outlined the whole overview of the browser wars thing. So what do you have to say about that? And he just sat there, and it was, time stopped, and and finally I said, well, while you're pondering that, but he got back to it, cause it knew, but it was, you had to confront him. It was like a little war of wills there, and he's got a strong will.
Well, if I might, what was the interaction model? I can't believe I used that phrase. Interaction model with Steve Jobs.
The UX for Steve Jobs?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, totally different. So when you interviewed Bill Gates, you had to be totally prepared. If you made the slightest mistake, he'd use that as a way to kind of distract the whole thing there. You would make some comment about like the GEM operating system, and he would say, well, actually, it wasn't that way, it was this way, and just take you down the side road there, right? So you have to be very careful when you interviewed him. Because he always kind of tangle you in a little dispute there. So you had to sort of know how to steer the thing around, or just little open the gap a little, because he actually did get to the questions there and sort of understand what you needed there, but you had to earn it. So Steve Jobs was a self-starter. He knew what he wanted to say to you, and he would go on. So after he did his pitch and said all the other things, that was the time to start asking him the questions about other stuff. And I was lucky because I got to him early in his career. Later on, it turned out other journalists who would ask him those same questions, he'd end the interview, he'd walk out, right? But I was sort of grandfathered in to ask him a challenging question here and there.
Yeah, so on that subject, I read your Insanely Great in the mid-90s, and then about at the end of the 90s, another book came out by Michael S. Malone called Infinite Loop. And so it made Insanely Great kind of look like fanfic almost. So how did you react, or were you aware of this other book?
Well, I mean, I'll dispute that fanfic thing. I think that basically, one chapter began how the Mac almost failed. There was a lot of stories in there that just the whole story about Jeff Raskin getting booted off the team. It was all the stuff you read in Walter Isaacson's book. As a matter of fact, a lot of it was taken directly from Insanely Great, on there. So I'll push back on that, and I'll stand behind that as the history of the Macintosh, and not to dispute Malone's reporting.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi.
I noticed that you have worked closely with generations of great hackers, inventors, founders of startups. Have you noticed any interesting similarity or dissimilarity among generations of them?
Right.
Technically speaking, some of them could be grandfathers of the younger ones.
Right. Well, when I did Hackers, it really was a story of generations there. It was my first book. Again, I was running that engine of desperation, like wow, this really has to be right there. And I took on a pretty ambitious task to really tell 3 different stories there of 3 generations of hackers, beginning with the very first hackers, as we know them at MIT in the late 50s, early 60s, and then went to the Homebrew Computer Club, and finally was what contemporaneously was happening. So I was writing the book in the early 80s, mid 80s, about game hackers. And on the 25th anniversary of the book, I went and interviewed some people, some of them who were in the book that I followed up on, but some of them who would have been in the book if I had written it 25 years later, like a Mark Zuckerberg there. And I thought it's interesting. The one thing that was really different, that would have surprised me when I published the book in 1984 is I actually sort of had a dark outlook that money would ruin hacking. But what happened was that somehow the idea of being a billionaire became, one which was not in opposition to being like a pure hacker now. So somehow they worked it out where, you could be idealistic and, being, having all the riches in the world wasn't a conflict with that. They pulled off that trick, which is.
Well, is it fair to say? I've always thought this to be true, but maybe I'm wrong. That if I look back at earlier generations of entrepreneurs, particularly with regard to the internet, that most of those folks came into it with a passion other than financial. In fact, most of us back then didn't really think that this was going to be something.
Right.
Yet today it does seem like there's a much higher proportion of folks who are coming into it to pursue wealth.
Well, I think, but also the idea is that everyone says, I'm changing the world.
Wow.
Yeah. But I do feel that the idea that you could be super wealthy by pursuing it doesn't necessarily mean that your vision of changing the world isn't one which is idealistic, right? So look at this company there, right? Who could be richer than your founders? But on the other hand, I do believe that they pursued this, from the start in their days of Stanford, saying, wow, we can change the world.
As a writer and journalist who interacts so closely with people in the tech industry, you probably bring a unique literary and worldly background into some of these discussions. And I was wondering if you've noticed that a lot of entrepreneurs and CEOs have very strong opinions about life, the interactions of people, maybe religion. And do you feel like these engineers and entrepreneurs have read enough books, or should read more books, or are reading too many books, basically?
That's a great question. I feel, in general, everyone could read more books. And there are, it varies. I mean, some people haven't read a lot of books. I think it's fair to say, in general, that people who were in their 20s haven't read as many books as people who came out of college in my era there, particularly when they have such fascinating things to occupy their minds, that aren't books that we didn't have when we went to college there. So that isn't necessarily a criticism there. Though I do feel, I guess what I'm sort of waiting for is, I do believe that you're more fit to compete if you have that kind of background that I think you're referring to there, of reading books and getting those lessons you can only get from that extensive and concentration in books. So I'm waiting for the recognition that that's so the people who really want to get ahead are also going to spend a lot of time reading books there, and so as an advantage over their competitors.
Venture capitalism has certainly changed a lot over the time that you've been reporting. And it seems that now there may be more motivation financially, but also there's also a lot more impatience. If you haven't become a huge success within 18 months, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing this. How do you see that changing? And do you see that as a problem, or is there a solution to that?
I think, look, an entrepreneur knows what he or she gets into when they do VC, when they take VC money. And as it turns out, it's been everyone that's super well documented. The stakes to get in and build a company now, what you have to bring financially to it are lower than they've ever been there, right? So there's a little more leverage that the entrepreneur has over the VCs. And I think really, if you look at the time frame though, in the late 90s, man, people were going public, and doing, things for liquidity way earlier than they are now. There's any number of places that didn't even have a viable business plan, let alone, like a penny of revenue, that went public and had not great outcomes from that.
What did you think about the situation with Secret, and not just them, but as you said, they're not necessarily going to the public markets. But we're in this interesting arena now where people are raising vast amounts of money against valuations that may or may not be plausible. Also, founders taking money off the table.
Well, I mean, it's all this to be expected when you're playing a lottery game, right? Mm-hmm. So the VCs and especially the seed investors will tell you that their model's based on a couple hits out of 100, which more than compensate for the vast majority of ones that don't pay off. So that stuff is just to be expected. I think it's a good thing. I think it's a positive thing that we found out all this about Secret, because now there's more of a stigma to cashing out and buying a Ferrari, and maybe we'll see a little less of that.
Yeah. Before we go to the next question, I'm going to pull one from the Dory. Speaking of writers, which fiction writers do you think have the most interesting insights about technology?
Thomas Pynchon is really on top of stuff, and it was interesting and not a surprise to me, really, that his most recent book was about Silicon Alley, right?
Yeah.
I actually used one of his a passage from him in the epigraph of a book about artificial life, where he was writing about something that seemed to be, to me at least, about cellular automata.
I think you mentioned that the range of news sources was getting more limited now because of mobile devices. So just wondering, what do you think about how mobile devices and sort of like fast news has affected media in general?
I don't think we've seen the full impact yet. I think we're still a lot. There's still a lot of newsrooms that are operating at a lag. It's like like the Wile E. Coyote running past the cliff, and I guess in recent years we've seen that moment happen where whoops, there's nothing propping up Wile E. Coyote, and there's a plummet there. I think in mobile, we've seen that moment happen on the web, but not quite yet in mobile. There, I don't think we've gotten the full impact of that format there, let alone figured out a way around it.
I also think that when we look at patterns of content consumption today, people look and say, "Oh, gee, it's all about cat videos and so on and so forth." But I sometimes think we've lost our sense of comparative scale. Like we see someone like The Guardian or BuzzFeed with 200-300 million uniques. as if somehow those folks are interested theoretically in serious content. I mean, if you look back in history, during the heyday of mainstream media, the percentage of our population who actually consumed content from those vehicles was comparatively small.
Right, and I mentioned it before, but I think it's worth re-emphasizing that there is a hunger for well-reported, well-researched, well-written, long-form stories. When I was at Wired, I came to favor a kind of story where I do a deep dive into a product right before it was launched, right? And I did one, for a couple Google products there, right? And people really appreciated that, as opposed to getting the quick takes the day after, or based on the product announcement, or like a briefing the day before.
You've reported on lots of successful startups, but my question is, what makes startups fail?
Well, there's a lot of things, but mainly, they misjudge, who's going to like it. They don't have the lesson that the people in the original Macintosh team had, saying, do it, build the product you really want. Sometimes they'll do a product and saying, like, well, those people might like something like that, but I think that you have to see if it's really great, to understand it there.
I do think timing is a not insignificant factor.
Sure.
I mean, if you look at the history of entrepreneurship, how many ideas that are successful today were actually surfaced 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
Different time.
Yeah.
Different
Point well taken. I did a big story about the tablet computer. Bill Gates and Microsoft's tablet computer there. Besides the stylus, which was a great idea, and Windows, which was not a great idea for a tablet, it had a lot to do. It looked a lot like the iPad.
Yeah. Yes.
So, what is the brightest idea you've ever had that miserably failed?
The brightest idea I ever had?
That failed miserably.
Interesting. I know there were some.
I forget.
Huh?
You forget about that?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, there nothing. I guess clearly the fact that I haven't been able to come up with it right away, because even though I know they're there, shows that I've probably gone back and erased it from my memory there. I think that at Newsweek there were any number of dead ends that I pursued, and tried to sell them that that didn't work out there. Although I will say one thing. I once did a story about, because I don't want to get away without saying anything embarrassing. I once did a story. I had a column for Rolling Stone for a little while in the early '80s, and talked about technology and everything from television, things like that. And I was reporting on the brand new channel called the Weather Channel, which I thought was a total flop. It would never last. And the headline was, "When it rains, it pours." So I've gotten some things wrong.
Yes, but what you weren't thinking of then was the number of people who are willing to equip vans with videos and chase tornadoes.
Yeah, that was before that.
I mean, the Weather Channel is hardly about the weather anymore, except as a meta for a story.
Right.
Stephen, you said when you were a journalist, you were always sort of the outside.
I was a journalist.
Well, you work for Medium now, so
Okay,
it's it's different. It's different.
Okay.
And you said when you joined Medium, you were excited to now be an insider.
Right.
But as you said, your background is still editorial. You're still a journalist. What insights are you providing the product managers, the engineers that you don't think they quite grasp because they don't have the editorial background that you have? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's one role that we do have, that the journalists who are working at Medium, do provide there, is that to say, hey, here's what we did here. This could have been better, if the product did X or Y, right? So, for instance, the thing I mentioned before, where we got a lot of comments, responses actually to the David Weinberger story. It surfaced some ways that I felt we could do responses better, and I'm writing a thing on our internal version of Medium called Hatch, with some lessons that we could learn from that.
Hi, Stephen. I'm just wondering if more media publications, kind of like Backchannel you mentioned earlier, will look into doing sponsored content.
Right. Well, I think, as I said, we started it today. And I think it's one, way that, you could do ads and get out of the, chase for, just clicks, right? The one thing I'm proud of, that we have in Backchannel, I think this goes for a lot of medium in general, is we don't lure people to the page with misleading headlines. Like our bounce rate is like super low. But for an advertiser point of view, if they're just looking at page view, that's just as worthwhile for them as spending like a long time on a page reading something and getting something out of it there. So in this case, if a sponsor is going to be clever about it and bring up something which is inherently interesting to people, but somehow illuminates, their product, their field, it's a win-win, and it helps us support, in theory, the kind of journalism, that everyone loves, in an era where, the business model still is, I think it's going to end, but still is, bringing people to the page and clicking on it.
What are your favorite sources of long-form tech journalism, just so we have it on the table?
Well, look, I'm always been a lover of Wired magazine from the time it started. I think Business Week is doing really good work these days. That I'm really encouraged that a lot of the online sites, which did not start doing that, are doing quality long form there. BuzzFeed, Business Insider. I mean, that even though that might not be the majority of their content, they're investing in long stories there, and and of course, sometimes people, like Clive Thompson, who writes for the New York Times Magazine. There's lots of bylines I always look for.
And I last night read a great 12,000-word article on ISIS from The Atlantic on my phone. Mm-hmm. So it can be done.
Excellent.
I just want to thank you for being with us. This has been an interesting hour, and we just look forward to your continued great writing and insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you.